video game industry has exploded in popularity in recent years, with the global games market projected to hit more than $200 billion in revenue just this year alone.
In the 1980s, gaming was split between two companies. It was Sega and Nintendo, but it was all about to change. Nintendo's ambitious ways brought them to the top of the industry. They were once rumored to be tied with famous Japanese criminal organization Yakuza and running illegal gambling operations and love hotels. But that same ambition was about to create a monster in the gaming industry that no one was prepared for. A young engineer named Ken Kutaragi was looking to buy his daughter a computer. While they were out shopping, Ken saw a game console called Family Computer. Computers were starting from $1,000, while this Nintendo Famicom was only $80. So Ken decided to buy both of them. A week later, he realized that his daughter was only playing with Famicom. Ken took the matter seriously and started working on a secret project. He wanted to keep the project secret because the company he worked for was strictly against gaming. Sony, in the late 80s, was a tech pioneer. They were ruling the digital data business with an iron fist thanks to this new technological advancement called compact disc. Before that, floppy disks were default data transfer method, and the biggest data capacity of a floppy disk was 2.8 megabytes. Compact discs, on the other hand, was capable of carrying 700 megabytes of data at minimum. Ken would not dare to bring up this childish gaming project to Sony, so he went on a rogue mission and decided to talk to Nintendo himself. Sony's only product was not compact discs. Way before that, Sony was making waves with sound technologies. Matter of fact, their current CEO, Norio Ohga, started working at Sony by sending a letter to the company. In his letter, he was saying how Sony's, or as known as TTK at the time, latest product sounded so bad and how he could have done way better job. And as a man of his word, Norio got an internship at TTK and fixed what he has promised and led the company into computer age. That brought him his new status as CEO, and in the late 70s, he personally hired Ken Kutaragi to Sony. Ken convinced Nintendo to let Sony create the sound chip for their next gaming console, and he did not mention anything to any director at Sony until he seals the deal. While everybody was sure Ken was going to get fired by the end of this little adventure, SCP-700 sound chip was a real success with Super Nintendo Entertainment System. Ken Kutaragi found more power in himself with this project, so he decided to take things a little further. He convinced Nintendo to solve one of their biggest issues. At the time, all the games were sold in cartridges, and each game cartridge was able to carry 98 megabytes of data at most. But with Sony's compact discs, games could have been at least 7 times bigger in data, and supply chain problems would be solved. See, when you're creating a game, cartridge was a trouble work. Any third-party game developer had to go to Nintendo exclusively to create their cartridges for their games, and in a relatively new market like gaming, estimating the demand was not always easy. Let's say you're a developer for this new game called Biohazard, aka Resident Evil. For the first batch, you make a deal with Nintendo for 1,000 cartridges, right? And if the game fails, you have to pay for those cartridges anyways and lose money from a very little profit you just made. And if the game is a success, now you have to order 1,000 more cartridges. But it takes from 3 to 6 months for Nintendo to release a new batch of cartridge. In the meanwhile, your game loses hype and the second batch sales flop. So now you have to pay for that second batch and you're gonna lose money from your initial sales. This was making all the new developers afraid to get into gaming in the first place. But Ken suggested Nintendo that if they trust Sony with their new compact disc technology, developers would be able to create bigger games and restocking problem would go away, because for Sony, publishing new batch was a 3 days work. So Nintendo agreed and they started co-develop their new gaming console, Nintendo PlayStation. Project was going great. Ken already had access to great CD reading lenses, so all he had to do was adapting the readers in CD formats for Nintendo. Everything was on schedule, and at the new Consumer Electronics Show, Sony was going to show their first tech demonstration. At June 1st, 1991, Sony took the stage to announce their partnership with Nintendo PlayStation. They showed their new 3D game graphics demonstration, and they had really positive feedback. Developers and consumers were really hyped for the next chapter of gaming. Next day, both the directors of Sony, including Norio Ohga and the director of the project Ken Kutaragi, took their seats in front row to watch Nintendo's announcement. When Nintendo took the stage, they announced their upcoming console. Nintendo CDI, and their new partner for their CD technology, Philips. See, Nintendo got paranoid because Sony had too much to say in this project. Working close with game developers and seeing the development process of Nintendo consoles, Sony might have created their own gaming console and bury Nintendo. So Nintendo decided to attack first. They made a deal with Philips for the same console and discarded Sony. They let Sony humiliate themselves and announce a console that was never coming out. After the CES was over, Norio Ohga announced an emergency meeting with the board of directors and Ken Kutaragi. Ken was sure that he was going to get fired. Knowing that he had nothing left to lose, he decided to push his luck even further. He was going to try to convince Sony to make their own gaming console. But when Norio Ohga came to the meeting, he didn't let Ken say a word. He let all of his chairmen speak their mind freely. After listening to them about all the different reasons that he should fire Ken Kutaragi for, Norio was upset. No one was mad at the Nintendo's betrayal, but everyone was mad at one of their own. Before Ken Kutaragi get a chance to speak his mind, Norio decided to create a new division. Shigeru Maruyama, CEO of Sony Music Entertainment at the time, was going to be the new CEO of Sony Computer Entertainment, and he was going to oversee Ken Kutaragi while he develops the Sony PlayStation. That way, Ken would be away from the chairman who thinks he should be fired years ago and focus on his work. While Ken was developing new PlayStation, he still had no idea how to sell the console. That's where his new boss Shigeru came to play. He told Ken Kutaragi that no matter how good the technology is, people buy tech products to consume good content. That's why, when he was the CEO of Sony Music Entertainment, he was investing in artists and signing contracts with them to get the publishing rights. Because without good music, products like Sony Walkman were simply useless. So Ken took this advice and started a new branch called Sony Interactive Entertainment. Under this new branch, Ken started convincing developers like Bandai Namco and Ubisoft to make their new games for PlayStation. Besides all the advantages Sony had over Nintendo with compact discs, Sony PlayStation was also offering 3D graphics, which was impossible except the arcade machines at the time. When developers realized that if they work with Sony, they can make 3D graphic games for home consoles, have at least 7 times bigger data space they can work for every game, be able to restock in days, and do not have to split their profits 50-50 like they have to do with Nintendo, they made up their minds quick. But Sony was not just trying to make a successful gaming console, they were trying to bury the competition. PlayStation had a couple more moves. First one was the developer deals. PlayStation's launch titles were getting developed by Ubisoft, Electronic Arts, Atari, Bandai Namco, Crystal Dynamics, Naughty Dog, and Capcom. Sony's this early support for the relatively small developers would one day bring these legendary games to life. But perhaps the biggest developer attack from Sony was Square Enix, developer of one of the biggest titles of Nintendo, Final Fantasy. 6 months after release of Final Fantasy VI, PlayStation was released and Square Enix made a deal with Sony right away. This was one of the biggest titles that Nintendo lost, but Sony was not just fighting them in one front. Right before consoles released in Japan, Sony started a commercial attack. They found out that retail stores in Japan that were selling Nintendo consoles did not have a big profit margin. Best of the retail stores were selling them for 15% of profit at best. Both consoles of Nintendo released before and after PlayStation were priced at $199, and profit per console was between $20 to $30 for every retail store. PlayStation was priced at $400, but Sony promised 25% profit margin for everyone, which meant $100 of profit per console to every retail store in country. So when 3rd of December arrived, every store was pushing PlayStation. According to Sony's initial report of sales, some stores even hit all the other gaming consoles except PlayStation. Sony took Japan market by storm, but it was not enough. West was the next front for the fight, and they had a plan for that too. In the Western front, Sony was differentiating itself from Nintendo's or Sega's gaming narrative. While both other brands were trying to keep their products relatable to the kids, Sony's marketing was standing out and sending a message to the market.
I'm talking about this. It may look like a harmless bagel toaster, but inside is a deadly donut. How do you know PlayStation is not a normal game system? Users lose all sense of reality and enter another world. Here we have a normal, healthy young man. And here we have a fellow who's been experimenting with PlayStation for only a few minutes. Remember, do not underestimate the power of PlayStation.
PlayStation was not just for the kids. They were developing games that were dedicated to grown-ups. From action-filled adventures blood-filled horror games. But after this rebellious marketing in the Western world, Sony took things a bit further. Before the console came out in the United States and Europe, Sony had a presentation at a famous Electronic Entertainment Expo. Steve Race, head of development at Sony Computer Entertainment in America, took this stage and did the presentation that started the bad blood between Sony and rest of the gaming industry. One of the ground rules for E3 was, presentation should be a keynote. It should set the overall tone for the product and include only development progress and no commercial information such as which stores it will be available or what will be the release price. But Sony and Steve Race had another idea.
Up next, the Sony PlayStation.
I'm going to ask Sony Computer Entertainment President of America, Steve Race, to join me for a brief presentation. $299.
Before its first year was done, console had more than 150 different games. Developers were changing sides one after the other. Ken Kutaragi took his revenge and became the flagship of gaming consoles of the current generation and generations to come. But as I've told you before, Sony was not trying to win. It was trying to destroy Nintendo. After a successful year, family-friendly Crash Bandicoot came around. In real life, he was a real menace.
Fear not, plumber boy, the Bandicoot will come. I'm coming to get you, pal. Hi, how are you? Am I on the right street? Can you tell me where Nintendo is? Hey, plumber boy, mustache man, your worst nightmare has arrived. Pack up your stuff. I got a little surprise for you here. Check it out.
I'm gonna have to ask you to leave. Is that Italian?
No, Bandicoot, it's an Australian name.
Feldman. Joseph J.
Feldman, Joseph J. According to my research, you're in the market for a new game system. Are you aware, Mr. Feldman, that Sony's PlayStation has more than 150 games? NHL Face-Off 97, Jet Moto, Tobal number 1, Destruction Derby 2, Crash Bandicoot. I could go on. I'm going to give you a personal demonstration. Get off my lawn, you freak. Coming up. Joseph J.
But the last nail in the coffin was Final Fantasy VII. PlayStation's big transfer was not just a blow to Nintendo, it was also a great success to Sony. Final Fantasy VII became the second best-selling game of the console, right after Gran Turismo. By the time it was 1999, PlayStation was the clear winner of the fifth generation of gaming consoles. It was dominating the US market with whopping 60%. Rest of the 40% was split between 7 different gaming consoles. Ken Kutaragi finally achieved his dreams. Norio Ohga got his revenge. Shigeo Maruyama became an entertainment legend by making Sony one of the best both in music and gaming industry. But Sony tasted glory in gaming once, and it was not planning to stop.
Welcome to the